This is the Hall Institute, and we're back discussing the issue of stem cell research. Father, one of the interesting aspects of the stem cell research debate has been the opposition to the use of embryonic stem cell research. And as I look at it, a lot of that opposition is based on the notion that life begins rather at conception, and conception begins immediately. But yet your greatest theologian in the Catholic Church, Thomas Aquinas, specifically rejected that argument and argued that, in fact, ensoulment didn't take place till up to almost 40 days after the fusion. Why is it that the current Catholic Church, especially the bishops, feel very strongly in taking a perspective that is divergent from that of their greatest theologian?
Well, the issue is that Thomas Aquinas was not a scientist. He was not an embryologist. He had virtually no acquaintance with the events of how an embryo is produced. And in other words, he was starting from a faulty initial assumption. And once you do that, then you can't derive a reasonable conclusion. Science has now made it very clear that all three of us who are sitting at this table were once embryos ourselves. And once you have that basic insight that there is a material continuity with our very humble embryonic origins, it becomes crystal clear that any action directed against an early embryo will disrupt the entire timeline and future of that individual future taxpayer, and therefore is always an immoral kind of proposal. It's a proposal that can never be rendered just. So Aquinas was simply out of the loop on the science, and his conclusions, he couldn't speak about the science with any competence. So we live in a different age than Aquinas did. He lived in the Middle Ages, and he was working from those limitations.
When you hear, Dr. Cohen, the types of ethical discussions taking place by political candidates for the presidency, and more importantly, candidates who support various presidential candidates, based on their attitudes towards issues such as embryonic stem cell research. That's becoming a litmus test almost as much as Roe v. Wade now. What's your opinion? How do you, when you look at that, especially as a native Canadian, do you say, gee, that makes sense, or boy, these people are really outside the loop, or what?
Well, as a Canadian, we have different rules and regulations, and also I was brought up in the Jewish Orthodox religion, which also has different views. But if you just strictly look at the science and you think, well, there's some contention over the definition of life, well, we know what death is, when someone's heart stops beating or when they lose brain waves. So if you want to draw an equal and opposite reaction, shouldn't life begin when there's brain waves and or a heartbeat? Well, that's, one argument, but we really don't know. There's no way for us to actually measure as a science when a soul enters a cell, whether a soul actually leaves a cell or not, whether part of a mother soul and a father soul fuse and become a new soul to mirror the biological entity. So it's very hard to argue this as a science. So as a religious background, I think policymakers should either decide, will states and the U.S. be a religious state or a strictly science-based moral state? If so, religion and morality, while they merge, we have to separate them and decide where to go with this moral question. When does life begin, and how important is it to our state without any religion? Because New Jersey itself has probably dozens of different religions with dozens of different views, but I think we can all agree on one moral center.
You see, I think the key in the analysis here is not actually religious at all. It's kind of a funny thing that I, dressed as a priest, am sitting here, and my argument would be religion doesn't matter at all to this. This is a question of basic human rights. Once you are constituted a member of our species, is it fair or not fair to use that new member of the species for the cells and parts that they might be able to be harvested for? Is that ever a right thing to do? You don't need any religion to see the problem there. I'd like to give a simple example, because this is all about law, right? We want to have laws that govern how we do this. In 1940, we passed a very interesting federal law to protect the American bald eagle. And this law basically says that if you're out there in the wilderness walking around and you see an eagle flying overhead and you shoot the bird out of the air, you will suffer very, very serious legal sanctions and penalties. Well, that makes sense. You want to preserve the bird. But it also says if you find the nest of a bald eagle with eggs and you destroy one egg, you will suffer exactly the same legal sanctions and penalties as if you had shot the bird out of the air. Now, an atheist can appreciate the cogency of a law like that. What's inside that eagle's egg? It is an embryonic eagle. The very same creature, the very same animal that flies gloriously in the clouds overhead. So, all we have to do is look at our own humble origins as embryos and see that they deserve protection equally as much as you and I do, because we ourselves came from that humble beginning.
I want to look at where we think we're going in the next 5 or 10 years, what we're capable of doing, and what are the consequences morally and in terms of public policy. So we'll break and come right back and discuss that issue.